Vado ora ad introdurre il professor Depaepe. Il professor Depaepe è professore emerito di storia dell'educazione e della psicologia presso l'Università Cattolica di Lovagno e è tra gli studiosi più noti del nostro settore in ambito internazionale. È editor in chief della rivista pedagogica e storica ed è stato presidente dell'ISCE dal 1991 al 94 e ora è membro onorario della stessa associazione. Numerosi gli interessi di ricerca, ne cito alcuni: la storia dell'educazione e delle politiche educative in Belgio, la storia dell'educazione coloniale e postcoloniale in Africa e l'uso delle fonti visive per la storia della scuola, la riflessione storiografica e metodologica sulla storia dell'educazione come ambito di ricerca. Professor Depaepe will now submit a report on how to represent pedagogical processes in school museum. Please, Mr. Depaepe, you can start whenever you are ready. You have 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you see the PowerPoint? No.
In this moment, no. In this moment, no.
Now, yes.
Yeah, now, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Perdonami se non parlo italiano, but you can see the Italian title in red: Come rappresentare I processi pedagogici nei musei scolastici. Sì. How to represent pedagogical processes in school museums. When I accepted this idea to present here a paper, I did it primarily for the fact that I am engaged since the beginning of this year or the end of 2020 in a research project at the moment in Riga, where I am working as a leading scholar at the University of Latvia. I apologize because myself, I am not very specialized in childhood history nor in museology, but throughout my personal life, I did a lot of research on the history of education, as has been said in the introduction. And I think there is, of course, the relation between the history of education and the history of childhood, in this sense that schooling became at the center of childhood during the 19th and 20th centuries, mainly because of compulsory education that became compulsory everywhere, education, schooling, and so being a pupil seems to have been the daily duty of children. But in my research, I focused on what happened with them in schools, in classes. What is exactly classroom behavior of teachers, and how does it affect the behavior of children in the short, but also in the long term? There are, of course, a lot of theories about it, and one of the most important in my view is what has been developed in Stanford. This is the grammar of schooling. I will not explain it, but I know it's very well known among researchers everywhere. What we did in Leuven, because we worked in a team, so I use the we form, the plural form, is to develop this grammar of schooling into a grammar of educationalization. And I mean educationalization in itself is a neutral term, but it has some negative effects in the sense that there becomes too much education, in this sense that people are too worried about what is going to happen with children. But the important thing I want to say here is that it is much more than the idea of Foucaultian disciplinization, of which we have been accused wrongly in using history of education. What we did, you can see very shortly, we focused on the change from, let's say, purely individual education in the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, probably with a step of mutual education towards classical education in the sense of classroom education with the instruction of the teacher, classical traditional teaching. And we tried to analyze what's going on we want to break the silences and go to the images as well of what happened in schools. But like you can see, all these pictures are not very dynamic. They are very static. You see the teacher and the children in the classrooms. And what we did was comparing different periods in history, and our conclusion was that the text of teaching in classrooms was very stable. But what changed was the context, the economic, social context in society, and so on. Just to prove this, what you can see here is the text of a classical education in the Congo very recently. It's really the idea, although they don't have the material conditions that we have to do education, to perform education, you can see the same basic ideas of how a class is functioning. And even this is an Italian picture I found. It says it represents the classroom of the future, but still this classroom is very ecological, but it's very green, but the idea is still the same. You have a blackboard, a green board here, and green chairs for the children and desks for the children. So probably my title is too ambitious and too ambitious a question. I want to avoid pretentious answer. Perhaps it would have been easier, as I did once in an essay, to say, they asked me, the philosophers, how to write history of education. I say, I cannot say that. What I can say is, how do you better not write history of education? There are a lot of possible answers. There is more than one single solution, of course. I am not the wisdom. There is a lot of discussion on these issues, but hereafter I will only stress some aspects of my ideas of representation, which will be, I think, rather simple, but they are based on more than 40 years research and experience in the history of education, including visits to school museums in different countries around the world, and expertise as advisor in the Education Museum of Ypres that has been closed at the end of 2016, and I was very upset about that, and you will see it probably. It is also related to what I have experienced, as I said, and what I found is that most museums, and this is not bad, but most museums are run by amateurs because there is too little money for them. There is too little interest from the state, from the authorities to build museums and to keep them. But on the other hand, there probably a less positive side is that the treatment of the past by these non-professionals and the heritage is based on nostalgia, on amateurism, and the main question still is, how do we treat the main question they pose is, what is the use of it? What is the relevance of it? What are the lessons? Because most are former educators, teachers, and so on, and that leads us to educationalization. They want to educate people. They want to give them lessons, and mostly in those presentations you can find on the internet. There is also in Germany, but also I saw it in other countries, some historical teaching, they call it, that is the children and the teachers play or undergo the teaching of the so-called 19th century or whatever, and they play schools, and you have a lot of anachronism in schools from different period. Things are a little bit chaotic. There are PowerPoints that circulate on the internet. The school of l'école d'autrefois with nostalgic memories, souvenirs, and the past was a lot better than nowadays, and so on and so on. That is the idea behind a lot of school museums. And they look for lessons from the past. Of course, history of education, and certainly in the countries that has been influenced by German thinkers, you have the tension between the two terms, history and education. And in languages like mine, in Dutch, is historische pedagogiek. You have, of course, this tension between pedagogy and history. What we can see, and I think we have to move in with educational museums in the same direction, is because it is related to the treatment of the past. You can see that most foremost in the research on the history of education, there has been an evolution from pedagogy towards a social and more even cultural history of education. Historical interest, to history, to cultural history. The idea is that the field has to be developed more for historical interest than for educational interest. The same evolution, more or less, took also place in teaching the history of education, and that had as an effect, of course, that the history of education, which was in the 19th century, because it was related to this pedagogical, to this moral, to these ethical goals of the curriculum, was at the center of the curriculum, developed to the periphery. But I think we cannot go this old conception of history of education even in teaching. We should teach history of education, which is based on research and which is in the realm of cultural history. And probably we must go in the same direction to build professional educational museums. And even if you look at the history of educational museums in the middle of the 19th century, they were purely didactic institutions without even historical intentions. They wanted to show to the people, they came from the World Exhibitions idea, how the modern didactic means were and what you could use in classrooms. But I think we have to go to more or less cultural museums on a professional basis. We are not yet there, but at least we can try to have cultural approach, the same cultural approach, and that has, in my view, also indirectly educational value. I will not go into detail, but there was a recent interview with me in the Dutch journal lesson, which means lessons. This is very typical, and it is the Journal of the National School Museum in Dordrecht in the Netherlands. On the basis of what I experienced with Frank Simon in the Ypres Museum, a city which is devoted to the Great War, and they have a big museum, and we were the small museum. It was like David against Goliath. But this big museum wants to propagate, wants to be a peace. In my time when I was a boy, it was a war museum. Now it is a peace museum. So they want to develop, they want to educationalize the idea of peace everywhere in the world. So they wanted to do the same with the education museum, more or less. But in my view, this museum had to underpin the idea, what is the critical role, what has been the role of the critical role of the school in society in coming the modern society. We have published, we mostly with Frank, different articles on this. And I think for doing so, for becoming cultural history of education, for becoming a laboratory, because this is my main idea, that museums has to become the laboratory for research, then we have to overcome two idealized, triumphantical, educationalized, which are always moralized messages behind a school museum. Because if history, and if history of education a fortiori is used for something else than for intrinsic purposes of history, it easily ceases to be history. And so I think we have to try to overcome these tensions and contradictions between pedagogy and history, between also memory and history, and this whole idea of heritage education, peace education, as I said. We have to use, I think this was also one of the ideas of the foregoing speaker, memories as sources for history. And it's a title of an article with Frank, it's all about interpretation. And I think we have to tell in history of education the best story about the educational past on the basis of a variety of sources. We have to reflect on the critical role of schools in society. This was the museum in Ypres, which became in the famous hall of Ypres, which has been destroyed by the Germans in the First World War. Then we had to move to a church, which was not a very good idea, but this is a little bit a chaotic image, and there I was teaching my students at the time in the museum of Ypres, and like everywhere, benches, desks were central in this museum, and this was a little reconstruction of a classroom in the 1930s, and one of the initiative takers of the museum, a school inspector, said to me, "This is my best beloved place of the museum. It's the class of the 1930s. It's my class, and you see where this nostalgia comes from, and where it has the idea of we have to improve education by going to history, by take lessons from history, and so on." Of course, this is not the idea of the new cultural history of education, but I already said, and I want to stress this again, this is not necessarily a Foucaultian interpretation of history of education. We have been, in our research, much more pragmatic. We think history is a complex process, needs multi-layered explanations, needs different points of view, and it is very important to change perspectives. And this can also be the case, I think, by visiting good school museums. In one of our articles, we have developed the idea of the school desk. A school desk, as I already said, is an icon of all school museums in the world. But what about this desk? What is the effects for education? And this, in the literature, I come back to this, is mainly seen as a disciplinary tool. I think you have to escape that idea of disciplinary straitjacket. It can be also a source of opening the world, but it can also be a source of resistance. And in school museums, it traditionally represented as a very static artifact of the educational past. In the literature, as I said, there is the disciplinary gaze, the Foucaultian gaze, and the biopolitical context. There are, like in Germany, the book of Hilna, Disziplinierte Körper, the school desk is seen as an educational apparatus in order to discipline the corpus, or the body. Here you have in Dutch an analogous book, which is the title The Forgotten Body, Het Vergeten Lichaam, and one of the ideas is desks played a role school desks played a role in the medicalization and of education in the 19th century, and this was by the a German gymnastic teacher who was working in Antwerp in Belgium in 1874, invented an anti-masturbation school desk. Don't ask me how it worked, I don't know, but any case, you had to put the hands above the desk. A source which is not which is important, I think, is the one of Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin is referring to his own experience. He was ill at the house because of his nearsightedness, and he had to have a desk at home. I think this description, and certainly the second part of the description, is very revealing that the desk should not be necessarily a disciplinary tool. It's just like one of the clerics, he said, the medieval paintings kneeling at the prie-dieu, but for me it was something that opened the world. I was sitting there when I liked it, and I could read my books there, and so on and so on. It was the opening of the world. I think this is a beautiful text. In this burrow of mine, I would begin reading, sought out the most peaceful time of the day, and this most secluded of all spots. I would then open my book to page 1 with all the solemnity of an explorer setting foot on a new continent, we should say today on a new planet. There is also resistance, not using school desks was also an act of resistance. Here you see this is a painting I found in a museum in Groningen in the Netherlands, a boy who is against all that disciplinary and schooling and so on, and he is peeing, just like Manneke Pies in Brussels, on the school desks. And here you see they are fighting in the school desks because they do not want to sit in the school desk. Is not always have been used in a schoolish way, of course. But the problem is, how can we visualize that kind of complex, dynamic processes? Of course, one would say use films, use the visual, the pictorial turn, and so on. In one of our articles, we have fought that idea because in history, of course, there were no cameras in the schools. But even if there are cameras in the schools, they change the behavior of the pupils, they change the behavior of the teacher even. So we have been accused of iconophobia by pleading for the use of multiple sources. Of course, we are not against the use of the visual, as you can see even in this PowerPoint. But I think you have to have written or oral, and even if you have oral sources, you need written sources to justify what is in these sources, or to control what is in these sources and what is the real historical context of it. Of course, and that's the problem with education sources, most of education sources are educationalized in the sense that they do not describe the reality, the complex reality, but they are focusing on norms, on values, what ought to be, as the Germans say, what should be sollen und sein, the tension between what ought to be and what is. But I think we have to develop a technique, and in the book Order and Progress, we have in the first chapter done an analysis in this sense. We have to learn to read normality through the normativity of sources. In these presentations, I cannot go into detail. But I think one of the most important also for researchers, but for museum builders, is the combination of sources, making the visualization more dynamic. For instance, using sound. I found this but I cannot play it anymore because in my device it doesn't play anymore. But when I was in Macerata, I got the DVD Trabanchi Caderni from the thematic exhibition at the time, and the representation, for instance, of the fascism by march music was very interesting, I think. We can also do that, for instance, by confrontation of other sources. For instance, the meritocratic function of schools and intelligence tests. In some of the didactic plates, it was seen that the house curve is very normal and is a natural law. But if you look at the other hand, the statistics of participation in schools, you see this never was the case that this was represented in the participation. I referred to Roberto Sani, who is taking part in this seminar, and in the description of the DVD, I found un suggestivo itinerario. I think this is very good said. It is, of course, a suggestive itinerary of going back to, if you can combine that kind of sources. In the concrete, school musea should become, in my view, more professional, more scientifically oriented towards cultural history without losing the positive side of amateurism. And that was also the idea of the first meeting of the French-speaking museums, of school museums, in which Jury Meda, for instance, took part for the of Italy. The idea is, I think, that you have to cooperate to strive for synthesis, but first and foremost for historically valid research against the as background of the museum, avoiding too much presentism, anachronism, evangelism, that is evangelize a message for the pupils or for the attendants, avoiding parochialism, let alone recuperation and instrumentalization of history for ideological or political reasons. I cannot go into detail, but this was, for instance, I think, the case with the peace education and the heritage education in Ypres. Yeah, and you can also ask, do they work? I don't believe that isn't working, but anyway, it is. I think in the concrete, what we should do is strengthening our meta-reflection on our own position, theoretically, methodologically, philosophically, ideologically, anticipating to criticism, but also taking criticism seriously, I think. Has this still educational value? I think so, because the effects of the spectator, you don't need a pedantic guide tour in a museum. I think let it to the spectator, a non-pedantic confrontation with exhibitions. This cannot be planned. This is the idea of educators. Everything very technologically has to be planned. One can only hope, it's an appeal. We can only hope that it will appeal the visitor, giving the latter, as it were, a kind of aha experience that allows a liberating meeting and sometimes also a healing dialogue with the past. And in my view, this does not necessarily lead to a moral and at the same time a historical condemnation of the past, but to a better understanding of the zeitgeist of the time, and thus also to more self-reflection, to more putting wisdom in perspective, which may also be accompanied by a postmodern irony about the way in which people in the past worried about the education of upbringing their children. For instance, and this is what von Hentig, but von Hentig is a very discussed pedagogue at the moment in Germany because of his own sexual education and so on. But nevertheless, I think he has good quotations. But for instance, in sex education, the numerous concerns that have been developed throughout history that time, how we have overcome that and so on. This leads to I think, wisdom, postmodern irony. The same applies to gender inequality and the participation of university education. If you look at the painful arguments of the Catholics, for instance, in my university, and the bishops that were put forward at the time to maintain this inequality, I think you are laughing that it was like that, but it was also very painful, of course. By the way, there is the last thematic issue of Simonetta and Tanya Fitzgerald is about that same topic. But very recently I became aware of this because it just 100 years, it's only 100 years in my university that the Belgian bishops, who were at that time responsible for our university, believed or accepted girls as students at the university. Not so much because they believed in it, but because they were afraid that otherwise they would go to other non-Catholic universities. But they still had the idea that a university degree would neglect the duties of girls as mother and wife. Here you see some of the pictures we used in the exhibition. This is what was called a pornography in even in the 1950s. And if you look at these publications, they are so innocent in our time. And finally, just to finish, to think critical, this is an image I used much in my teaching because I think it opens eyes and it starts to think critical about the educational past. And of course you can use that in education museums, but I never saw it. You can ask by yourself, but you can also ask to the audience, what's going here? First of all, you see a classroom with computers. These computers are not very wise ordered in the classroom, but it's electronic devices that just arrived. It tells us about globalization. It tells us about the division in the world between the rich and the poor, between black and white, and so on and so on. But it is, of course, the good Europe that sent computers to the Congo. But what do you see here? This is a priest, and this priest is blessing the computers. So the belief, the appropriation, I think, the belief that you can save computers by blessing them, that against, I don't know, in my time when I was a boy, they also came to bless, the priest came to bless the brand new car my father bought. This is a habit that totally disappeared in our secularized society in the West, but you see the level of appropriation in Africa. And this asks us not to condemn, is that good or bad? That's not the question, but the question is what we have learned, what we have taught here in Belgium in the 1950s is still in the mentality, in some of the layers of the mentality in Africa, and that is due, or that is an effect, probably a non-intended side effect, but that's the way in which education works, of the education campaign of colonization that we have done in the Congo. So thank you very much for your attention. That was my speech. Thank you very much.